any of you are watching The Traitors, but I have flown back from Westminster this afternoon, and I have promised my daughter that we will watch it this
Yeah,
evening.
that's
Um, but talking of traitors, it's obviously been quite a newsworthy day in Westminster today, but probably not when either Robert Jenrick or Nigel Farage were planning, because it's quite clearly spiked the Reform press conference here in Scotland, unveiling Malcolm Offord, who, like me, is a Greenokian. I think that's where the similarities end, as the Reform leader in Scotland. Yes, I always would say to him that I knew where Garville was in relation to Greenock, but yeah, but he, obviously with the legislation changes that we've had in Scotland, for all that he said that he's giving up his peerage, the reality is if he wants to be an MSP, he cannot remain a peer. Because the legislation has now changed for a double mandate, whether that be Holyrood, Westminster, or indeed the House of Lords has changed. So he's not being quite as selfless as he's potentially making out to be. So, but there's no doubt that in many ways, we are in a state of flux, and in some ways, from a political party perspective, the rest of the UK is experiencing multi-party politics in a way that Scotland has been managing for some time. But there's no doubt that the rise of reform means that we are in a six-party system now, rather than the five-party system that we've been in more recent years. And I'm sure you will all have seen the polling that suggests that reform could end up the official opposition at Holyrood. And what I would say to you is obviously I am somebody who's knocking doors now. I'm primarily doing that in North-East Fife, but I am finding reform-minded voters. So it is not a polling chimera, and there's no doubt that what the levels of support you're seeing in other parts of the UK are potentially higher, but it's challenging to get underneath the reasons for that. In terms of, for a lot of people, it is that they're just a bit scunnered with everybody, so it's a plague on all your houses. There are people with what I would say is clearly concerns about the topics such as migration, which has come up the agenda, and we know played a part in relation to the European Union referendum. It's usually because they've had some failure, or their family member has failed to access some kind of NHS support or some other public service, and so they're presented with an easy sort of target to blame. But and it depends how much opportunity you have to have that conversation. But it's also interesting because despite that, we and you all know, and I'm sure better than me, that polls are consistently showing that across the UK, the majority of the UK population would now vote to rejoin the EU. But sadly, that is not where the overall UK debate is, although I think it's obviously clearer cut in Scotland. And indeed, I just looked up before I came online, and I think it was something like a sort of amalgamation of support was 73% of Scots would look to rejoin the EU, and that was first, but not far behind was London on 65%. So, although it's obviously been a very difficult few years, and I'm sure we all have concerns about reform, if nothing else, for their position in relation to Europe, it does feel that. That people's minds are changing, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I think it would be remiss of me not to sort of talk about this from the international perspective as well. Indeed, I was on Newsnight last night, and thought I was coming on as a former police officer to talk about the Tel Aviv Maccabee and the West Midlands Chief Constable. But by the time I got to the studio, it had been replaced with Iran. Well, we were always going to discuss Iran, but Greenland had come on to into the debate as well. And obviously, I'm sure we'll all have views about the approach that the UK government is taking. But one of the things that I take some comfort from is clearly the work that's been done in relation to the Coalition of the Willing in Ukraine, but also, the ongoing, the recognition that there increasingly is with European nations, with the UK included in that, in terms of our future geopolitical support. I might be slightly underwhelmed about the one member of Armed Forces personnel that the UK government is sending to Greenland, but I think that commitment to NATO and that support for Denmark shows that even although we are not part of the EU, which is something we would all want to see, there is no doubt that we are working with our European neighbours and partners. And for those who want to see a future rejoin the EU in the UK's future, that can only be a positive thing. But going back to 10 multi-party politics, I mean, I'm not going to lie that as a Liberal Democrat, I feel a real sense of frustration that we've become the third party in Westminster, which brings with it a whole change in terms of responsibilities. So when I was one of only 11 MPs, I had multiple portfolios, but I had absolutely no guarantee that I would get in at those departmental questions because we were not the third party. We were relying on the ballot or a bob. And obviously we've got responsibilities in relation to the PMQs now that our leader gets, the delegated legislation and bill committees that we're part of. We have at least 2 members on every select committee as well. So we do have a significant presence in Parliament, but there's no doubt that it feels that some of the politics is not necessarily happening in Parliament, and that outsized impact that reform is having is a real sense of frustration. 10-minute rule bills, and there have been 2 of them of particular interest from a European perspective, are the. In some ways, they are just mechanisms in Parliament for private members' bills that are never going to go anywhere. So the private members' bill process works by, at the start of each session, MPs pick a number, write their name in the book, and if they are one of the 20 names that are drawn out the book, they will have time to debate their bill on a sitting Friday. Other options for private members' bills are what's called a presentation bill, where literally the title of the bill is read out in Parliament. You give a date for a future reading, but the reality is that the Parliament will not find the time to get to that reading. And 10-minute rule bills are also a first reading, but it gives the opportunity to have a 10-minute speech made in support of the bill. And indeed, a 10-minute speech can also be made in opposition to the bill. And the expectation is if there is a speech in opposition to the bill, there will be a vote. So the first one that's obviously of interest to us all was Nigel Farage's 10-minute rule bill in relation to leaving the ECHR. And I say the ECHR because I was obviously sitting there during Nigel's speech, but I'm not necessarily convinced that he was clear. He was not clear on whether he meant the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights. And I think that was exactly his intent, not to be specific in relation to that, to create the ambiguity that he is very good at. And what you will see is a number of MPs did stand to speak against the bill, and the Speaker had selected Ed Davey. A vote happened, and we defeated that bill from progressing to its future second reading by 2 votes. So in terms of the bill, it's not going to go anywhere. I'm sorry to disappoint. We're also, we're going to be proroguing and ending this parliamentary session towards the end of April. But I think there was something powerful and symbolic about the fact that Parliament voted to remain in the ECHR. Now, frustratingly, the government have determined that when votes on 10-minute rule bills happen, they won't take part in them. But there's absolutely no doubt we would not have won without a number of Labour backbenchers who voted along with us, the SNP, the Greens, Plaid Cymru, in support of that. So, I am Chief Whip. That was quite an active whipping operation to make that happen. So that means that Nigel's bill doesn't progress. Really frustratingly as well, there is actually for 10-minute rule bills, there's an agreed rota between the 3 main parties for who gets what slot. So Reform actually stole that slot because the current parliamentary processes allow for that to happen. So that is work ongoing to address that. Though I do think, again, multi-party politics does mean that the smaller parties should get something at some point using those, because they're obviously, they can be good parliamentary tools to build a campaign on. But the second one, which I'm sure you're interested in, is Al Pinkerton's 10-minute rule bill in December, which was in relation to joining an EU customs union. Now, the Lib Dems have had since 2021, we've had our European policy paper that set out our four-stage process that would specifically look at, and I'm just checking my notes, the final part was ensuring that that we moved to seeking to join the single market. Now, for the benefit of here, I mean, the reality is we've not stated that our policy is rejoin, but if you actually look at the detail, it's the only direction in which it takes you. And I'll be honest, we're a UK party, so we're recognising that, you know, these are things that will not happen overnight. But the customs union is something that we clearly wanted to move in the direction of. So again, that was spoken against and a division called. And I've never experienced this. I've been an MP now for 6 years, but there was a draw. Um, um, it was trickier, I think, for Labour. Labour in their whipping operation made more of an effort to encourage colleagues just to abstain than they did in relation to Farage's, because obviously you will all know that there is not just a private debate going on in Labour in relation to this, the comments that David Lammy, Wes Streeting and others have made. So obviously to have a number of Labour backbenchers voting alongside us would have been more undermining to the government and the Prime Minister than the ECHR vote was. So what then happened is that the Deputy Speaker or whoever is in the chair, is required to cast the deciding vote, and the expectation and the convention is that they vote in favour of the motion for the bill to proceed. So that's what happened. So it was a win, but it was a little bit of a squeakier one than before. But, you know, very disappointing for me to see, you know, Conservative MPs who previously, you know, were at the very least remain adjacent very strongly. You know, they were whipped to vote against the bill. So as I say, the bill will progress, but the reality is it won't. The private members' bills in this session have been. Well, it's been an extraordinary session because of assisted dying legislation, which has basically taken up all the time, the 15 Fridays that are given over to private members' business. And the only way we will actually have an additional sitting Friday is if the assisted dying bill passes the House of Lords and comes back to us with amendments. The Commons would need to look at those amendments. So that is the reality. But again, what I would say is there's that statement of intent in relation to the fact that symbolically Parliament has voted for a customs union. And I suppose that would bring me on to what else is happening in Parliament. So we are expecting an EU reset bill to come to us before Parliament prorogues in April. And I think the intention of the government, as it's been given to me, is they would hope that to have that bill past its stages in the Commons and then be what's called a carryover bill when Parliament is prorogued, which is basically that the bill will not die when prorogation takes place, it will not fall, and then it will be picked up in the Lords in the new session of Parliament. So this is obviously in line with the EU negotiations that are, you know, ongoing and were subject of the meeting that Labour had in May last year. So there are still, it's going to be quite interesting from a legislative perspective in that negotiations will be ongoing while the bill is proceeding. As a result of that, there's been some discussion about whether there should be, because the House of Lords still have an EU Select Committee, and there's been some discussion about whether similar is required in the Commons again. But we're all pleased to know that Bill Cash has now retired from the House of Commons, so hopefully it would be a more useful and valuable vehicle. But as you can imagine, and how it feels is, and I haven't worked out, in some respects, I feel like we're probably being quite helpful to the government. But I think our position of always pushing the government a bit further, or being seen to push the government a bit further, in some ways is helpful to them, because I think it gives them, you know, that opportunity to move as well. But it doesn't mean that it's not incredibly frustrating. So that is sort of the most significant legislative thing that's going to happen. And what I would say is you would expect, and I'm sure other pro-European parties will be attempting to amend that bill, we'd certainly be looking at it from a customs union perspective. I find it very interesting that in recent comments, Starmer said that he would actually prefer to rejoin the single market, as opposed, and we're like, brilliant, but it does suggest that the government has made this commitment that it will respect the result of the referendum, but is actually dealing with the political reality. And for every Brexit betrayal, it is really the reality of what leaving the European Union, the customs union, and the single market means. It does mean increased trade barriers. It does mean increased costs. It does mean the inability for our young people to move across Europe, and simply that the cakeism of the Brexiteers has been shown to be what it is. And that remains of deep regret to me, and I'm sure to all of you as well. So I just wanted to cover a motion that my party had at conference last autumn. So our customs union call was for a bespoke customs union by 2030. The motion also called for new opportunities for young people to live, work and study more easily across Europe. I think that's the one that feels most achievable at the moment, given the very welcome return to Erasmus, plus the fact that a youth mobility scheme has always been in discussion. We were also talking about a rearmament bank with the EU, which was a proposal from two of our members, which would support enhanced financing for defence programmes across the UK and Europe. That is the reality in which we live. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I do think we have seen the security and defence partnership, as I mentioned already. But and what has been very good in relation to barriers has been the mandate to negotiate on SPS agreement, so which makes things easier there. But where we are disappointed that we haven't seen is we still haven't seen sort of improvements for UK touring artists. That has been an ongoing issue right since the start. That mutual recognition of professional qualifications is still a barrier. We've not really made progress on associate membership of the European Defence Agency, although I do think the conditions are being created for that. We've not secured access to the Security Action for Europe fund, and I think that is more difficult politically, particularly sort of between France and Germany. And that lack of clarity about the EU's entry and exit scheme and disruption for travellers. We know potentially that visa waivers are going to be required for future travel to the European Union. And I mean, there's a bit of schadenfreude about all this, isn't it? With people that took a different view to us, but that is the reality of leaving, that there are consequences to it. We do. I think I'll probably conclude there, and happy to take questions. But I'm a Liberal Democrat. We tend to always look on the bright side. In that it does feel that there's a significant shift in movement in many ways. What there is not potentially is that shift in movement properly being represented in Parliament. And the big bit where I become glass half empty is the fact that multi-party politics and a first past the post system produce results that nobody really can anticipate. And when we look at even the Scottish elections coming up, the current polling has the SNP only falling by a small number of seats on a much reduced vote share. That is the reality is if there was one democratic voting system that sort of produced the perfect result, I'd hope that everybody would have it. But there's absolutely no doubt that, for example, in the local elections in England last year, a council seat was won on a vote share of 18%, which is quite terrifying. I have to also say it was a Liberal Democrat, but that does really demonstrate the challenge. So take some heart from the fact that although the polls are consistently showing a majority Reform government, their vote share is going down. Plus, as I say, they tend to have a more spread vote share, which means that the sort of they would all be very potentially marginal seats. And I think that has been what part of the challenge for Labour has been. A huge majority in July 2024, but people on very marginal seats and vote share. And because they have just got off to such a terrible start, and I think part of that is because they had clearly not done the planning that needed to be done in advance, which is frustrating because the reality is you never quite know what the vote, you never really know what an election question is going to be, or the overall election question that the electorate is going to answer, usually until the election starts. But we actually really did know in 2024 it was anybody but the Conservatives. So Labour must have known for some time that they were going to be in power. But I think the fact that they've done so poorly in government since means that's why it looks so incredibly grim for them, because lots and lots of very small majorities. And I think that's one of the reasons why the sort of talk about Starmer's leadership is not going away, because you have a group of people who know things are going badly and potentially also know that they're only in Parliament for one session, for one term, because they're not going to stay. So where is the motivation to be loyal to the leadership? It is therefore more seductive to, at least try and demonstrate that you're standing up for your constituents in some way, as opposed to towing the party line. But yeah, I mean, I don't quite feel like Johnny Reynolds' therapist session. He's the new Labour chief whip, but sometimes feels like that. What I would say is he's definitely missing his business secretary portfolio. But I'll leave it there. But hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of things that are happening in Parliament and things to look out for. And I'm pretty confident that yourselves and other organisations will be encouraging me and others to sign on to lots of different amendments to that EU reset bill when it comes.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That it was really, really helpful, I think, to go through all the different ways that there are to start a piece of legislation. So that was really
Yes.
educational. But just
I mean,
before
it's
we
interesting. I mean, it's funny because in other ways as well, sometimes sounds terrible, but sometimes it helps us for people not to totally understand how Parliament works, because it looks
know.
it looks like we're doing something that's potentially going to have more of an impact than it actually will.
But actually, just to clarify on the Al Pinkerton bill, I thought it did have time tomorrow, or did that get cancelled?
The date was given for a second reading tomorrow, but Parliament isn't actually sitting tomorrow. So private members' bill Fridays, there's 15 in any parliamentary session, and we've run out of them down our end. As I say, the only way I can see more being granted is if the assistant dying legislation comes back. So yes, so it's a date, but it's not a date when Parliament is actually sitting, so the bill can't be read. And if I'm honest, it's probably 20th on a list of bills on that date.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's two things that I'd like to mention, and then open the floor. It's just one of the things that we've been trying to campaign quite hard with the Scottish Government is what we would really like them to see pursue for the next EU-UK negotiation. And something that they have put in their paper, and we're really hoping that other parties will take on board too, is that if Erasmus and Horizon and these programs are back up and running, and hopefully we might manage to get something the next time on culture. It's about time that we found a way to have some UK national officials back in the institutions on some form of temporary, whether it be contractuals or a temporary agent, so that maybe they would still be having to be paid as though they were UK civil servants, but something just so that there's some people there. And equally, yes, we really want to help create a pipeline of young people who would be ready to take up roles when we do get back. And so traineeships are really important, and it's a bit easier to get into the traineeship part of the institutions. And yes, I'm not sure if we've really explained properly, Wendy, but we've now set up a local group like Fife4EU in Brussels. So the European Movement in Scotland has a Brussels group now, and we got 10 Scots in Brussels to be the sort of original members, and 5 of them are quite senior institution officials, and a couple are retired institution officials. So they're now really there and willing to help us to do that. And I think that the Scottish Government, as I say, have put it into their paper of what they're looking for, but it would be really helpful if other Scottish parties were putting on the pressure
Yeah.
on that front.
I
Uh,
mean, in terms of the manifesto, it's still in development for us. That will be other parties, and I'm assuming the SNP are the same. I, I'm presuming I haven't gone. Well, the government haven't put out the real detail around Erasmus, but of course, the part of the query has been around the costs. So I would assume that that would be one of the asks. But I think even I could go and ask a written parliamentary question in the first instance in relation to that, and then see what I get back.
yeah, that
That
would
that
be
might
really,
be that might feel like the right thing because that would then give you an understanding of what the current situation
yeah.
actually is. I mean, I remember being on Scottish Affairs Committee in the last Parliament when we had a session in relation to Erasmus and Turing, and Ian Stewart, who was the Scotland Office Minister then, and I said, like, tell me one thing that Turing has that Erasmus doesn't, and he couldn't answer the question. And the reciprocity, obviously, is North-East Fife with St Andrews University and the sort of local economy, etc. That was one of the things that Turing wasn't doing either. And yeah, I do feel that Alan Turing would be burling in his grave
Yeah,
if he had been
absolutely.
here. So yeah, absolutely. But there's
I'm
absolutely no
I'm
doubt
making,
that yeah,
sorry,
sorry,
just
yeah,
making more
go.
about it's not just students, because that's what people seem to be forgetting. And Fife did really well on community projects and things from the plus part.
Yes, yeah,
And
absolutely. And it challenges the narrative that Erasmus is a sort of middle class
yes,
thing, that it
Pieces,
actually
yeah.
is about across the piece. I mean, I'll remain frustrated, not to be too political, I'll remain frustrated that, the Scottish Government said that they were going to create an Erasmus alternative programme and didn't, when the Welsh Government did manage to create TAFE. But I think we are in the, I think, I think this is one that the UK Government have done the right thing on. And I think it was clear to me that Turing was not delivering what was anticipated. So why don't I ask a written parliamentary question about that? And then depending on what we get back, I can take that to Al Pinkerton, who is our EU spokesperson, is from Edinburgh. You might have picked that up if you watched any of the debate. And ironically, he's the MP for Surrey Heath, replacing Michael Gove. So I don't know what it is about that part of Surrey that likes to have Scottish MPs as their representatives.
yeah. So do any of the rest of you have something specific that you would like to ask Wendy? I don't want to hog the floor.
Yes, I have a couple of questions really on the
Yeah.
political weather as to how you perceive it. And one, presumably you have contacts with parliamentarians on the continent within the EU.
Yes.
How do they perceive the developments in the UK? Do they see us gravitating closer, or is that simply considered to be unrealistic within the present political climate? And the second question is a transatlantic one. Is there any evidence that the behaviour of the present US government is having any impact on attitudes towards Europe, either within your constituency or broader across the country?
Thank you very much, Paul. So if I think about the first question, I think I remember I was over in the States a couple of years ago with again Scottish Affairs Committee. We were over for Tartan Week, but I met a friend of Jeremy Purvis, who's our leader in the House of Lords, who was previously an MSP, who was the senior administrator, senior civil servant, basically for USAID, and I had dinner with him and his boss under Biden, and she talked about, and I think it's something that we forget, that not forget, but we don't appreciate as much as we should, that we are obviously the poorer. I think we would all agree with that. For the UK is the poorer for leaving the EU, whether that be financially or culturally, which I think we all feel strongly about. But the EU is for the poorer without us. Um, and she would say, and it was, she was being slightly culturally stereotypical, but she was saying you would have the Italians at one end, and the Germans at the other. And the UK were the people saying, okay, we actually need to get somewhere and find something and find a compromise. So, our departure has weakened the EU. There is absolutely no doubt about that. I think the other element is that, you know, and I'm certainly so. We're part of ALDE, which is the Association of Liberal Democrats in Europe. That's the grouping in the European Parliament, or Renew, I think it's now called. Is we cannot deny that that the politics that we're experiencing here in the UK is not being experienced on the continent. And, you know, I don't know how Marie Le Pen's, for example, appeal will go, but, you know, there is absolutely no doubt that we've seen the rise of populist parties in other parts of the continent, and indeed where they have power. So there is also that bit around the fact that the EU has diminished because we're not in it, but it has also changed in terms of what countries are looking for it. And I think that brings me on to answering your second question, Paul, which is actually it is the overall threat to Europe, and I say Europe rather than EU. Primarily in relation to Ukraine and Russia, but also in relation to Trump. And for somebody who said no more wars and they were, you know, the US wasn't getting involved in anything, he's been pretty active. And so I think that has brought countries closer together. I suppose my concern is you know, what the political leadership in those countries changes and how they feel. There's absolutely no doubt that Trump is a real Achilles heel for Farage, which is one of the reasons why I think he's distanced himself from him a bit more recently, and indeed why Trump himself said that he'd kind of lost faith in Farage. Now, part of that is because, you know, Farage is many things, but you know he has continued to refuse to be associated, for example, with Tommy Robinson, etc. So it does feel like that if NATO collapses, and it is possible, it will be that the US has left, but that others remain. And it's quite clear, I think Trump has talked about sort of, you know, the sort of Wilson doctrine in relation to the fact that it's quite clear he does think that US's responsibility is primarily the Americas as a sphere of interest. But it's also clear that he's quite happy to stick a hand in wherever he thinks there might be some political benefit. I mean, I've got absolutely no doubt that given he could actually do whatever, well, given that the US, from a defence perspective, can already put everything it needs to put in Greenland, and indeed has reduced its footprint in Greenland in the decade since the 50s, tells me that this Greenland thing is all about critical minerals. And Venezuela is similar in that, you know, the premise was drugs. Haven't heard very much about drugs since Maduro left and the cabinet reshuffle, because of course that's effectively what's happened, took place. It's all about oil. So, you know, but who knows what comes next. As I say, I did expect to wake up this morning with some activity, something have happened in Iran, and it hasn't. That's not to say it won't, and it's clearly not to say that there hasn't been executions continuing to take place. They've just not been happening in public. So a wee bit long-winded, but I hope that's kind of where my thinking is, and certainly the ALD.
First question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
I perceive some scepticism from continental Europe concerning closer contacts with the UK, and in particular the so-called Farage clause that supposedly is being written into any agreement whereby the EU would be compensated if Brexit recurs again. I mean, that indicates that there's a certain scepticism across there. Does it not?
I think you're right. And sorry, Paul. Yeah, and who can blame them? We've not exactly been a good faith actor in recent years. So yes, there's no doubt there is. I think it is the reality of having left the tent. Don't be surprised that if the people in the tent are looking out for their interests rather than yours now. I think that is realpolitik.
It's an issue that we discussed a fair bit at the last meeting of SAFE, you know, with Dr. Irene Oldfather.
Yeah.
The need to rebuild that trust in negotiation is really, really important, and that should probably be part of the run up to the next EU-UK discussions as well.
Yes.
And that a lot of what we've been trying to put into our plan for this year, because obviously there's the Scottish elections, there's also the 10th anniversary of the original referendum, and it's our 35th birthday as a movement. And well, we want to try to some extent focus on the sort of less political things, so but that also bring us closer to Europe. So things like our Euro walks, and we're going to have 2 of the trainees really looking at town twinnings across Scotland. Paul's going to be looking after them to try to establish which ones are still active, which ones could do with some support to become active again, which ones are council run, which ones are run by just a local association like the Losh one in St Andrews. And you know, that's a way to bring this sort of getting a bit closer together again without worrying about the political loss of trust, and building trust through civic organizations, and also through business, because obviously Irene has quite a few commercial and business interests in the SAFE group, and universities. And unfortunately, the loss of Scotland Europa to some of those organizations and European networks is really tragic, I feel, and it's really going to change the effectiveness of Scotland House. And I'm really furious that it happened, because I was very involved in the setting up of Scotland House, but we don't seem to be able to change it now. So we feel that that's a really important side that a cross-party organisation can do, but also encourage each party to try to think of ways that they can be building up trust in that way too. I think it's really
that's interesting and good to know. And from a twinning perspective, you know that last couple of years Largo has been twinned, and Limekilns is currently in the process of getting twinned, because I put people into contact in relation to that. So yeah, there definitely is. It's still something that's it's still something that is happening and under consideration, but I think it's good to check where current relationships are, very much so.
Yeah, well, these 2 students will be quite full time for 3 or 4 months, so we're really hoping that they can make quite a good fist of getting a good list together, and we'd use that with politicians from all different parties too.
Great. Yeah, I'm sure Fife Council, for example, you would hope that they would have some list somewhere, wouldn't they?
Oh yeah, and Paul's made a fantastic map of all the twin towns across Scotland, across Fife. So
Amazing.
quite good on Fife. In fact, we keep trying to get it into the education department of Fife Council so that schools could use it, because it's a really good tool. But we haven't quite succeeded.
I would say send it through to me and I'll happily share it with the education department. I mean, they'll need to respond to me, so.
Good. Okay, that would be
Thank
great.
you very much.
Yeah, okay. And we, as a cross-party organisation, are a little bit fraught about how to deal with, as you say, this much more multi-party politics now, where we've not just got the Tories, but now we've also got Reform, who are also clearly not anywhere close to what we're trying to do. But we can't ignore them. So we're just sort of looking for advice about how to deal with them, because you're not the first of our recent speakers to say that. I think there was a council seat up for grabs, and when we were talking with the Kirkcaldy SNP MSP, he was saying that going round, I think it was in the Weems village areas, it was really noticeable how often they were told, "Oh well, we've had enough of you lot. You've not changed things in Scotland, and this new lot down there, we're not having them again. So we're going to vote Reform." And you know, and so what do you believe you're voting for, and voting for Reform, and nobody knows.
No. And it's actually really, and I mean, it's probably the same for yourselves as a group as it is for me as a member of a political party. Like, I always sort of remind myself that I'm not normal, in that I'm a small percentage of the population that chose as part of my hobby social life to join a political party, let alone become a candidate for it. And simply that people don't, and that's why I do think things like, the barriers on holiday, or the roaming charges, those kind of things that directly impact people's lives and they remember what it was before, are those kind of truth points in relation to, well, these are the consequences of departure. Because most of the time people don't think about, I'm not saying they don't care, but they just don't think about those things in the same way, which is why I think things like the touring artists and those kind of things, again, those are areas where there is a salience with people that really brings home the impact.
Yeah, and if some of what the government's doing in terms of the PSP stuff, and things that are actually a little bit complicated to explain, like you said earlier about legislation, if that can just be worked on quietly and in the corridors of power back in Brussels and be achieved, then that is a step toward. I
Yes.
mean, things like the
Yes.
negotiation, you're getting a step closer to a single market. If we're all going to have to make the same size of guns and the same size of bullets, even though I don't really want to be making more of them, that is creating a single market.
Yeah. Yeah, and the reality is I don't think any of us want to, but also the first role of the state is to keep its citizens safe. And we've probably, there's no doubt that the post-Second World War consensus is probably more fragile than it's ever been. And I say that as somebody with, children of 21 and 18. It's not something, it is something that wakes me up at night, and I think John Swinney said likewise. So even where there's differences in political opinions, there's absolutely no doubt that those are the concerns that we need to be thinking about and considering. I mean, I think the other bit we've probably not talked about is just disinformation. So Reform are not coming out and saying that an SPS. I mean, it's interesting. Whenever we say something about Europe in the chamber, Richard Tice is usually there because he is the one Reform parliamentarian who I think takes Parliament itself seriously. He's quite an assiduous attender. He participates more. I mean, Lee Anderson. I mean, my imposter syndrome. I sometimes think in Parliament, I should have more of an imposter syndrome than I do, because I do think most parliamentarians should be cleverer than me. But Lee Anderson is not a serious person. Sarah Potchin is really quite she's as horrible as, in my experience, as she's portrayed in the media. Who've we got left? And Nigel, Nigel is never there. He has done a couple of stunts where he's not come to PMQs. He's either sat in the gallery or done a sort of podcast because he says, I don't get a right reply. And there was somebody in my team who said, so what happens for the smaller parties? There is a rota for questions. So official oppositions get 6 PMQs, third party gets 2, and then there's a rota for the smaller parties. And the reality is that rota, obviously the bigger of the smaller parties are weighted, but it's still reality 6-7 weeks before they get a question. So Nigel does get a question there, but there's nothing to stop him doing what every other backbencher does, which is to put in a question or to apply for the ballot, and he doesn't do that. So we did do a wee story to say, well, maybe if you were applying for PMQs, you could ask one. So that was quite entertaining. But Richard is somebody who I think is more engaged with Parliament. But my little story was, whenever we say something about EU, he just says, Germany's in recession. That's always his response. Germany's in recession. So, yeah. So it's, there's absolutely no doubt that we're it's not just about these things being complicated and difficult to explain and people not necessarily being engaged. There's also the active disinformation that we have to deal with as well. There's no doubt about that. And I do think that was always one of the challenges for Remain. When you're arguing for the status quo, I think it is more difficult to say why this is good, because if you stay, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, because people didn't understand how it worked very well, because no government in the UK had ever actually taken the time to explain it.
Yeah.
They just hid behind the
But I'd also say how much attention would people have, as I say, until it directly impacts your life, how much do people engage? And that is the reality of democracies the world over.
Yeah. So we are going to run a couple of stalls in probably, we'll wait till it's a bit warmer in March, Wendy, in Fife. So we'll let you know the dates in case you want to.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm sure I will. Absolutely.
Andrews, and we want to focus on voter registration as one thing, but talking about things that are complex to explain. In our exec meeting next week, we're going to talk about how do we deal with trying to help people to get their head around what the second vote really means, now that there's again one more party, and one more party that's probably going to really be concentrating on getting list MSPs, and how's that going to affect the other parties, and what to do with your 2 votes. And it is really complicated to explain.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I do think that Reform will stand everywhere. I think they will stand candidates in the constituencies as well. But I think the Larkhall Stonehouse by-election demonstrated, in the same ways it did down in Caerphilly for Plaid, did demonstrate that the credible challenger, the party that is seen as being capable of beating reform and making that argument could do well. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, despite the fall in the SNP vote share, their seat numbers are not declining quite significantly, because they are potentially in a position where they will capture a majority of constituencies. And of course, in Fife, the reality is the current situation is North-East Fife is Lib Dem, every other Holyrood constituency is SNP, which means an SNP second vote will not produce a list MSP. So those are the. I mean, you obviously said talk about manifesto, etc., but you'll hear us and you'll see us talking quite a lot about the peach ballot, because that is obviously where in Mid Scotland and Fife we would look to make a gain if possible.
Yeah. Okay, so that is, we can also mention that on our stand, that that's how it will work for different parties. We're also, I mean, we are going to do a very simple leaflet with what we understand each party stands for in respect to Europe. So that's quite important too. Does anyone else want to come in at this point? Anyone else got anything they'd like to say? No, I'm a little bit conscious that it's not very many more minutes.
It's not long to the traitors. That's terrible. I should have. I mean, it was in my diary for an hour, but they know how to press pause. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah. No, you've given us a lot of your time already, and appreciate it's probably the end of a long parliamentary week. So thank you very much.
We had the finance bill this week, so finance legislation. Here's my other fact. They are finance bills are protected for time. So if there's a number of UQs and statements, the clock starts later, and so the time can run on. So yeah, the last votes on Monday night were at 11:15 at night. So
and a lot of whipping probably needed for finance bills too.
It was relatively straightforward, but I'm doing the London Marathon at the end of April because I'm mental, and so I'm trying to do my running on a Tuesday and Thursday morning. So the prospect of getting up at 7:15 was not particularly palatable. So yes.
Well done on getting a slot for the London Marathon, because it's really difficult.
Well, this is my other secret, and this is maybe where you stop the recording. As an MP, we can get a space out with the ballot. And that was one of my reasons for deciding to do it, because I thought it was the kind of thing that, in the future, when I'm no longer doing this job, I will think I had the opportunity to do that and didn't take it. I may feel differently about that decision on the 27th of April. But I will be raising money for Fife Carers Centre when I do it. So yeah.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, and it's been fantastic. All the new carer legislation, that's really excellent.
Yeah,
so well done.
Good. Yeah. Great. Well, we'll see. I don't have any ambition other than to complete it, so I think that's quite helpful.
Yeah. So where can we sponsor you?
I think I'm probably going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks, once I've got my fundraising pages set up, because I ran 10 miles at the end of by the end of the year was my goal to run 10 miles, and I've done that. So now it feels like I could actually do it, and it does feel a bit achievable because I've never done it before. So yeah.
Oh, well, excellent. Good luck for that. We will.
Great. So yeah, and I'll just say, Jo, thank you very much to you as always for all the work that you do, and thank you to all of you. Obviously, since I was elected, I've obviously engaged with many of you. I still, John Purvis and the work that he did, and know he'll be much missed. You'll know obviously that we lost Min Campbell in recent months, and he was obviously a real champion as well. But you're part of the movement that's been responsible for some of the optimism that I think we're seeing in relation to the EU, that you've not accepted our departure, and that's really important, that there's been a group of people like yourselves and others saying that we still believe that our best future is in the EU.
We do, and we're going to grow this year. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
So I will be in touch about the written parliamentary question. I will send over our latest policy paper from 2025, and I will get in touch with the top of the list candidates and get them to at least get in touch with you, Jo, so you've got their contact details if you do organise something.
Thank you.
Great.
And Paul, okay.
We will send you the twinning arrangement website.
Yes, that would be great, and I'll send that on to the education department and see what we get back.
Good.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Good evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.